Now, another conflict theorist that we're going to look at is Max Weber. I want you to note that even though his last name starts with a W, you pronounce it as a V. He is also German, and he was a sociologist, but he lived at a later point in history than Karl Marx. Marx was born in 1818. Weber was born in 1864. And because of this, he did most of his work about 2 to 3 decades after Marx had died. Now, Weber is also viewed as one of the founders of sociology, along with Marx and Durkheim. And while Weber is a conflict theorist, he's also one of the first people to point out some flaws in what Marx had stated. Having stated that, however, keep in mind that he also lived at a later point in history. And because of this, he was able to have more time to see how history progressed. So while Weber can pick at Marx's work a bit, and we can pick at Marx's work, we have the benefit of hindsight to help us see the flaws in it, while he was simply writing about what he thought would happen without a crystal ball. In any event, Marx pretty much stayed focused on this idea of a social class hierarchy, social stratifications, and the owning class and the working class. Unlike Marx, Weber saw that there was a lot of growth in between classes in the service industries. In fact, very rapid growth. He saw that there was a lot of growth in between classes. So, in other words, he saw that social classes were becoming less and less distinct. That it wasn't just upper class, middle class, lower class. He saw all these levels in between. Now, what do I mean by Weber saw a growing service industry? What he meant was workers who were not doing manual labor. They weren't trudging in and out of the factories every day, the kind of stereotypical lower working class doing all the grudge work. But at the same time, they were not owners. In other words, Weber recognized the development of workers who are professionals, a big expansion of the middle class. And he saw that unlike the poor, lower working class, this class of people had a higher economic status and thus a higher social status. Life just wasn't quite as difficult for them. Life wasn't as hard. They might not have been owners. They might not have been super wealthy, but they were definitely much better off than the lower class. And Weber viewed this as a flaw. Maybe it's easier or better to say that Weber saw this as an oversight in Marx's conflict theory, that Marx simply did not consider or predict that this social class would evolve the way that it did. I think a general way of summarizing Weber's observations of the social class hierarchy is that he just felt it wasn't as clear cut as Marx did. He felt that social class struggle and even just social class divisions were not as simple as Marx said they were, that there'd be a lot of different rungs on the ladder instead of just a few rungs as Marx thought. And Weber also disagreed with the amount of emphasis that Marx put only on class conflict. He didn't disagree that it existed. He didn't disagree with Marx's work, but he did disagree that it was the only driving point in history. He thought that emphasis should not be on class to the exclusion of other influences. So, for example, Max Weber also considered the influence of politics on inequality, and he considered the influence religion could potentially have on inequality. So again, Weber didn't disagree with Marx as a whole, but when it came to the finer details, he did kind of put his own spin on conflict theory. Now, the next part of theory that we're going to discuss in relation to conflict theory, I'm tripping over my words, is the cultural turn and post-structuralism, Gramsci and Foucault. This sounds really complicated. We're going to jump ahead in time a bit. Early conflict theory, as I've said, focused on economics, property ownership, wealth, that sort of thing. Those are what the upper ruling class used to control society, to dominate society, to maintain their position in society. And by maintaining their own position, they kept the lower class in the lower class. But as time went on, history progressed. Increasingly, conflict theorists began to take other things into consideration, just as Weber suggested. So they were thinking about how they too can either cause social and economic inequality or maintain social and economic inequality. What else could do that? These things include things you probably would never have thought of in regard to inequality, like language or music or advertising or even ideas, how ideas maintain inequality. And you might be thinking, how in the world can all of these different parts of a society's culture either cause social inequality or maintain it? I'm going to explain them to you, and once I do, I think you'll look at them in a bit different way. This is Antonio Gramsci. He was Italian and he was a Marxist. And that means he would look at society and recognize there were different social classes, that people had a different economic class and thus they had a different social class. As a Marxist, that's a given. He agreed with basic Marxism, basic conflict theory, that there is an upper class, also referred to as the ruling class. And he agreed that this minority of society maintained control and dominance over the majority, that they maintained their higher position by controlling the economic sector. But Gramsci added to this because he said that the upper ruling class also maintained their dominance in more subtle ways, in less noticeable ways, maybe we could say in softer ways than just straightforward economics. And this is what he called cultural hegemony, which I know is an odd word. And this means that a society's culture is also controlled by the upper class in terms of their values. And if this sounds odd to you, if it's difficult for you to understand, I'm going to give you some examples. What Gramsci was saying is that even in a culturally diverse society such as Canada, the ruling upper class control the culture of society. They manipulate the culture of society so that their own perspective, their own worldview, becomes the accepted cultural norm in society for everyone, no matter what their class is. What Gramsci meant by cultural hegemony was the ability of the upper ruling class to hold power over social institutions. And in doing this, they strongly influence the values of society. By doing this, they really strongly influence the general ideas about society and how it functions. So, when Gramsci's talking about the upper ruling class maintaining a society's culture, what he meant was a society's general beliefs, their general perceptions of the world around them, whether their immediate environment or society as a whole and how it runs. And by culture, Gramsci was referring to the values of a society, their perceptions. So perceptions about religion and education and the legal system and the political system and the family. And I'm going to use the education system as a specific example to explain Gramsci's idea of cultural hegemony, because I know that this can be a difficult concept to grasp. And the education system is something you all have a good understanding with and you have experience with it. So, education system. You're probably thinking, how the heck does the ruling class affect people's perceptions about the education system? How could that possibly happen? Because, you know, in Canada, we've all been raised to believe that in our country, we all have access to a fair, equitable education system that is available to everybody, regardless of their social class, their ethnicity, their religion, or their gender. In fact, in Canada, we've even gone so far as to make it law that everybody must attend school until a certain minimum age, because as Canadians, we feel that a minimal level of education for all Canadians is something we really value. So everybody has access to education, and there's a standard curriculum in every province and territory that teachers follow, and standard textbooks that all students read, and everybody's assessed in the same manner. These days, we even have rubrics, which we didn't have when I was in school. In other words, all students in Canada are on a level playing field when it comes to access to education. All students in Canada are on a level playing field when it comes to access to educational opportunity. In Ontario, we even have standardized provincial student testing. So, in grades 3, 6, and 10, all students are assessed in exactly the same manner with no variation whatsoever. What could be more fair and equitable than that? Well, with cultural hegemony in mind, Gramsci would look at the education system and point out that it's not a fair and equitable system in several ways, but we've all been kind of convinced to believe it is. Instead, he would argue that the education system actually helps to maintain social inequality, and specifically that it legitimizes existing inequality. It makes it seem normal and fair, and it does this by reinforcing a ruling class ideology in education. So I'm going to give you an example. We don't say, poor Jennifer, she was born into a family of a lower socioeconomic status, and that really affected her ability to be successful in school. And it really affected the opportunities she had to be successful in school. We don't say she wasn't as successful in school because both her parents worked 2 minimum wage jobs each and could not provide her an enriched Montessori daycare when she was young, or a computer at home, or a tutor, or lots of books and magazine subscriptions and craft things and other things to enrich her mind. We don't say she wasn't successful in school academically or socially because her family didn't provide her extracurricular activities in the summer, different sports or arts-related extracurricular activities, or put her on sports teams during the school year, or put her in clubs during the year, or get her involved in other activities at school. They didn't take her on trips to different kinds of museums and science centers and such. We don't say that she wasn't successful at school because her family moved about every 18 months because of their financial problems, and that her parents didn't have the time to get involved in the parents' council at school, or attend back to school night, or the Christmas concert, or parent-teacher interviews. We don't say that Jennifer wasn't successful at school because neither one of her parents have a post-secondary education themselves, so they were less capable of providing her assistance with her homework. They weren't really aware what steps to take to help her, and her parents were less able to effectively advocate for her with her teachers because they themselves were not comfortable in an educational setting because they weren't successful in school. We don't look at Jennifer and say she wasn't as successful in school because none of the teachers at her school have a master's degree or PhD. Only minimum qualifications, and sometimes they weren't actually qualified teachers at all. We don't look at her and say she wasn't as successful in school because of a lack of opportunity and resources. And as a result, she's still part of the lower class, and just as her parents are. Instead, the ruling class ideology in education legitimizes her failure and says Jennifer is unsuccessful in school because she didn't try hard enough. She could have enrolled in after-school activities. She could have asked her teachers for help. Her parents could have advocated on her behalf and asked the teachers and principal for help. She's unsuccessful in school because of her own performance and because of her family. That is the ruling class ideology in education. It helps to maintain inequality in society, and it makes it seem completely legitimate. This is what Gramsci would refer to as part of cultural hegemony regarding education, how the values and the beliefs of the upper class control all of society. In other words, cultural hegemony would point out that the education system as a whole perpetuates an entire ideology that helps to make inequality seem legitimate. So it might seem like all students begin their education on a level playing field, that all students begin the kind of proverbial educational race at the same starting point, when in fact they do not. And we all know that that is a fact, that students don't. So cultural hegemony would point out that this ideology, supported by the upper class, has simply become part of the dominant ideology of society as a whole. That things are the way they are because they should be. It teaches everybody to accept this notion. So part of cultural hegemony states that the working class are not being controlled just economically, but ideology, with ideas that justify and normalize the position and power of the upper ruling class. These ideas that normalize and justify the lower socioeconomic status of some people and families, sometimes for generation after generation after generation. So Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony focuses on the idea that it is much more than the upper ruling class's economics that control society. They also do it in less noticeable, more subtle ways. That a society's culture, its ideas, are controlled in many ways by the upper ruling class. That is Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony. Now, Michel Foucault, we're going to take this a little bit further. I think this is the last conflict theorist we talk about. This takes a jump ahead to the 60s and 70s and leads us to the idea of post-structuralism. Foucault himself was a French philosopher, and what he did was he looked at the relationship between power and knowledge and how this was then used as a form of social control by the different social institutions in society. And I want you to remember this basic idea, how power and knowledge are used to control people in society.